your remains.
Hello again everyone and welcome back. My name is Esero and in this video I'm excited to introduce to you the Ice Shot Void Fletcher Deadeye. One of my favorite builds and one that I've played multiple iterations of in different leagues. With the release of Blight League, Ice Shot saw a massive buff, getting additional cold damage worked into the gem inherently for the first time. At level 1 this adds 2 to 3 additional cold damage, but at level 20 it adds 75 to 113, providing Ice Shot with a brand new and powerful DPS boost that it has never seen before, taking an already compelling skill and making it even stronger. Ice Shot really does it all. It's a fantastic league starter and an amazing beginner build as the gem is available from level 1, meaning that Ice Shot can be scaled from the earliest stages of the game all the way into the very latest, capable of handling endgame maps, league mechanics, side missions, and boss killing. As you saw in the opening clips, Ice Shot is versatile, but its most powerful aspect is its clear speed. With the build operating at full capacity, we can clear entire screens in the blink of an eye. Chaining Herald of Ice explosions and other powerful AoE effects allows us to comfortably clear all league mechanics and even the deepest of the endgame. With a compelling crit-based focus, we'll be hitting critical strikes over 90% of the time when our flasks are up. Merging that with useful curses, Assassin's Mark, and elemental weakness, we'll be doing substantial damage with every shot, making it a fast, potent, and satisfying map farmer capable of handling just about anything you can throw at it. Even T16 and T17 areas can be handled with surprising ease with enough investment. We'll be stacking a reasonable life pool of 5,000 plus, combining that with a 50% chance to evade with an additional 50% chance to dodge both spell and attack hits that becomes 75% when triggering Vol Grace during boss fights. We'll also be recovering large amounts of life and mana using the powerful leech node Soul Raker, and utilizes additional defensive layers such as a cast when damage taken steel skin that increases our available life pool and absorbs incoming damage. But offensively, this build owes its insane clear speed potential to multiple sources. Ice Shot already has its own inherent AoE effect. When you hit an enemy with an Ice Shot projectile, it will create an explosive cone of cold behind them, damaging all nearby enemies within the blast area. Combine this with Herald of Ice. Whenever we kill a frozen enemy, they will shatter and create an AoE explosion, damaging all nearby enemies. Add to the mix a Void Fletcher Quiver, a powerful piece of gear that not only improves our damage, but gives us access to the ability Void Shot. Whenever we fire an arrow, it will consume a Void Charge to fire a Void Shot exactly where we were aiming, creating another massive AoE explosion, boosting our clear and dealing tons of damage by itself. And then we take all of these powerful offensive tools and wrap them in the Ascendancy of Deadeye, one of the most potent offensive options for Ascendancies in this game. The true raw strength of the Ascendancy for this build comes from endless munitions and ricochet, causing both Void Shot and Ice Shot to fire an additional projectile every time we attack. Ice Shot now also chains a single time, meaning that if the projectile hits an enemy and it hasn't yet chained, it will go from that enemy to a second enemy, redirecting and triggering its AoE cone effect each time. And finally, we get a crucial boost to our area of effect size from endless munitions, which gives us a 50% bonus. We see the benefits of this 3 times over, as it affects the Herald of Ice explosions, the cone after we fire an Ice Shot, and even the Void Shot explosions themselves. Later on, we'll be discussing ways to get additional chains, more projectiles, until we're firing 6 Ice Shot and Void Shot projectiles every time we attack, chaining AoE effects across the entire screen, annihilating everything in its wake. Ice Shot is a powerful, versatile, and satisfying skill capable of handling the entire game. I think it's finally time that we get into the gear choices that make this build possible. For each gear slot, I'll be presenting you with a recommended choice, as well as additional options when possible. These options will be separated into expense categories based on how much the initial investment will be to pick up the item. However, please keep in mind that my recommendations for budget items are going to fluctuate in price over time, depending on the demand that the community has for that item. Because of said unpredictability, I'm going to be refraining from listing direct chaos or exalt-based numbers unless it's very pertinent to the build. Items will instead be put into more broad price-based categories. A cheap item will be in the realm of 1 to 20C. A moderate expense item will be in the area of 21C to 100C. And an expensive item will be anything that goes above the 100C mark. With that out of the way, it's time to jump into the main endgame weapon selection for the build. And that is going to be the redundantly named Death's Opus Death Bow. This will be my recommended selection for the build and is a fantastic and powerful option, scaling all the things we need most, namely additional projectiles for our skills. The bow is available unlinked or 5-linked for moderate expense, but is really quite attainable, with a fully 6-linked version only costing us between 3 and 3.5 exalts. It'll be one of our cheapest options to pick up a 6-link for the build. The bow features decent physical damage, which we'll be converting into cold, and also has reasonable attack speed. But the real strength in the bow lies in its 50% increased critical strike chance implicit, and its plus 100% to critical strike multiplier. This takes the base critical strike chance of the bow up to 7.5%. The bow, as you remember, also gives us a 100% increase to our critical strike multiplier. Thus, the weapon essentially gives us 100% of our base damage and additional damage whenever we hit a crit. And on top of that, it gives us those 2 additional arrows every time we attack. That combined with the power of our Ascendancy already giving us an additional arrow and the Dying Sun Flask for 2 more arrows, and we'll be firing 6 every time we attack. This, in the mid and late game, completely removes the need to have greater multiple projectiles in the 6-link. Having that slot open for something else drastically increases our damage. This is my first and foremost choice for the build, and there really are no reasonable options in the same price range that accomplish what we need them to. However, and this is only for people who have a ton of money to burn, as this will be an extremely expensive option, you can pick up a bow that has attacks with this weapon deal 3 to 5 cold damage per 10 dexterity, as well as ideally a 20% chance to deal double damage and attack speed modifiers. Beyond that, additional crit chance, percentage increased cold or physical damage, or added cold or physical damage will make this weapon a monster. This is absolutely a viable option, but will only be available to those who can spend 10 exalts or more. I think with that, it's high time that we move into the Quiver selection. For this build, I went with the absolute beast that is the previously mentioned Void Fletcher Quiver, an item that incredibly carries a cheap price tag, but can be scaled to moderate if you want to get a good implicit, and will be needing to get a corrupted version of some sort for the build. This Quiver is really hard to compete with. It gives us a substantial amount of cold damage to attacks. It gives us nice defensive bonuses, such as maximum energy shield and a chunk of cold resistance, as well as a ton of sustain when using skills, because we can get up to 40 mana gained on kill. A really nice quality of life bonus that makes sure we have no mana issues while mapping. But its true strength lies in the Void Shots. It's going to be generating 2 Void Charges every second, and every time we attack, if there's a Void Charge available, it'll be using one of those to trigger a cascade of Void Shots, typically being 6 total projectiles, causing large-scale explosions, giving us a massive boost to our boss-killing potential and helping to aid in clearing up stragglers and just generally clearing packs quicker. Because we're focusing in this build on chaining Ice Shot, we want to get a Void Fletcher that doesn't have the implicit Projectiles Pierce an additional target. This is because in Path of Exile, projectiles act in a very specific order based on the modifiers applied to them. These modifiers typically being Pierce, Fork, Chain, and finally Return. The behavior of projectiles also follows that same hierarchy. First, they will pierce up to their maximum number of targets, and then when they hit the final target that they can pierce, they will fork, which means that the projectile will inherently split into two new projectiles. Those projectiles will fork as many times as they can, and finally they will then chain. The chain will send out one additional projectile that targets a nearby enemy, and then if it then reaches its maximum number of chains, that projectile could return to you. You will never really have a situation where all of these are stacked, and that's because you're going to be purposely trying to design a skill to work a specific way. In our case with Ice Shot, having an additional pierce is not bad, but the problem lies in that we have all these chains available to us, which we want the skill to utilize. There's only going to be so many enemies in a neighboring area, so having the skill only chain will mean that instead of piercing one target and possibly just having the projectile fade into the ether and not hit another enemy, we're going to hit that first enemy. It's going to check and see if it can pierce, it can't. Check if it can fork, and it can't. So it's going to immediately chain. That's why we want to pick up a corrupted version that has a different implicit, so that we're not going to be utilizing that first pierce and we just use all of our chains. There are a few really solid and affordable, either cheap or moderate corruptions that are available to us. We have added cold damage to bow attacks, the lower rolls being moderately affordable, but the higher rolls getting quite expensive. We can also go with point blank as an implicit. It just inherently provides us with that keystone, which means that we can unselect it from our skill tree and it'll give us an additional point. It will not double up its effect, but make sure that you have at least one version of point blank in the build. And finally, in the moderately affordable price range, we have projectiles deal 20 to 25% increased damage for each time they have chained, which means that the more projectile chains, the more damage it'll do for us. And if you've got a monstrously big budget and you're looking to spend 15 plus exalts on this item specifically, you can get either skills chain +1 times, giving us another chain, or bow attacks fire an additional projectile. This is a versatile and extremely powerful quiver, and I cannot recommend it more heavily. There are not a lot of really solid competing options. However, if you're that guy who got the deck stacking bow with the double damage and is just going to be stacking tons and tons of dexterity, your best in-slot option may end up being Huri's Demise. It will give you tons of elemental damage for your attributes as well as a lot of other beneficial stats. It's in the moderate expense range, and a corrupted version with an amazing implicit will be absurdly expensive. But if you are specifically going for that dexterity stacking bow and not the Death's Opus, this is a great option for you. Next up is going to be the helmet selection for the build. My primary recommendation for the build would be to pick up a rare helmet, one that preferably has an evasion base, features 70 plus life. You'll also be looking for percentage increased maximum life, as many resists as you can stack, and a really nice key stat that you can try to pick up if you've got the money for it is going to be nearby enemies have -X% to cold resistance. That kind of stat can provide us with a really nice boost to our damage, but fundamentally the rare helmet is great because it's just giving us all those core stats we just need to survive. If you have all of your resist shored up or you're feeling very comfortable on life, I also have 3 unique options that are evasion based and very cheap for the build. Starkhunge's Hood is a fantastic option and provides us with life, crit chance, dexterity, attack speed, and tons of evasion. Very, very solid, but does not give us any resists. Devoto's Devotion is another great choice for the build and features a lot of attack speed, a huge chunk of movement speed, as well as dexterity and chaos resistance. It's very light on defense, but it's one of the best options we have for mobility and clear speed in general. And finally, we're going to have potentially the most offensive option, which is going to be a Fractal Thoughts Vol Mask, which gives us increased dexterity, crit multi, and elemental damage, as well as a very small chunk of life. It is the most potent offensive option that I will be recommending for this build, although you have to sacrifice life and resists to make it happen once again. The biggest bonus though to the flexibility of the build and overall just reducing the price that you're going to be seeing for the helmet slot is the simple fact that Ice Shot does not have many enchants to choose from, and the best of them is going to be 40% increased damage, which gives us a decent little chunk of DPS, but it is not substantial and doesn't really affect the functionality of the build whatsoever, which ends up meaning that you can go with a whole bunch of different options for the build. A few really solid examples and things that I'd recommend to go for would be percentage increased effect of Assassin's Mark or percentage increased effect of Elemental Weakness if you decide to run that one additionally. You can get percentage increased blink arrow cooldown recovery speed, which will mean your movement skill will be up a little bit more often. One of the best defensive options we can get as an enchant for this build is going to be Steelskin grants 12% additional physical damage reduction, or the Steelskin buff can take 45% increased amount of damage. This just expands our potential life pool even more and is a fantastic addition to the build. Between all the different options that we have for the helmet itself and the variety of enchantments we can pick from, there's no reason why you need to spend a lot of money on the helmet specifically unless you really have the cash for it. Moving along, it's going to be time to discuss the body armor selection for the build. My primary selection will be the disgustingly strong Hiri's Ire. An evasion-based option that, while it does not provide us life, gives us one of the biggest chunks of evasion available on a single piece of gear. A well-rolled and qualityed version of this armor will give us right around 3,000 to evasion rating. And on top of that, it grants us 10% chance to dodge both spell and attack hits. But its biggest selling point will be the, at maximum, 188 to 262 cold damage added to bow attacks. This out DPS's a level 20 added cold damage support, giving us an essential 7th link to the build that is extraordinarily strong. An unlinked version of Hiri's Ire falls just a little bit into the expensive category. It's not outrageous, but to get a fully 6-linked version, you'll probably be spending somewhere around 4 exalts. Thus, if you're wanting to run this chest piece with Death's Opus, my primary recommendation for both weapon and chest piece, you're going to want to theoretically just pick up the Death's Opus as a 6-link because it will be about an exalt cheaper than getting a 6-linked Hiri's Ire. However, I do have several cheaper options that can serve the build incredibly well for the chest piece if you didn't want to run Hiri's Ire or you wanted to find something that was going to be a little easier on your wallet. My first alternative for you is going to be a moderately priced Lore Weave if it's either unlinked or 5-linked. This chest piece has got a ton of really good stats for us, whether that's going to be increasing our maximum resistances or elemental damage, giving us a bonus to our life and our energy shield, crit chance, fizz damage, it does it all. It has a little bit of everything all on one chest piece, but it kind of comes down to the rolls as almost every single aspect of Lore Weave can randomly roll to some degree. Therefore, you're going to want to try to find a Lore Weave that has a high roll on critical strike chance, life, elemental damage, and maximum resistances as the key stats to focus on. A 6-linked version with decent rolls can be found for the 2 to 3 exalt range, making it a bit cheaper than picking up a Hiri's Ire. If you're on a really low budget and you're looking for a chest piece that's going to serve you very well and boost your survivability, look no further than grabbing a Belly of the Beast. This chest piece has really low level requirements as well as attribute requirements, making it very easy to socket into just about any build. It gives us a massive bonus to our maximum life, a big chunk of resistances, and causes us to recover 50% more life from our flasks. So if you're using an instant life flask that would recover 1,000 life on use, now it will recover 1,500 every time you use it. If you're on a tighter budget, this is a fantastic option and can even scale into late game. These can be picked up unlinked for dirt cheap. Bought 5-linked for moderate expense, somewhere between 30 and 50 C, and if you want to pick them up fully 6-linked, they will indeed be expensive, but will only be in the 2.5 to 3 exalt range. Furthermore, if you picked up any of these chest pieces, or if you got your Death's Opus but it's not fully linked, and you want to get either your chest piece or your weapon to the point where it's usable, you can buy the Jeweler's Touch Prophecy for very cheap, and with a single Jeweler's Orb, you will create a 5-linked item instantly. This is a fantastic and very affordable method to get a usable item that you can scale into the mid-game and start running maps, making more currency, and looking to upgrade the build from there. And finally, I'll make a quick side mention for those of you who are super new. If you've got an ultra small budget, you can go ahead and just pick up a Tabula Rasa Simple Robe. This is an item that can be used from level 1 on and is great for leveling builds, but can also carry you into the early stages of mapping if you have no other option and you can't afford a better chest piece. This will without a doubt be the cheapest and most flexible way to run a 6-link in the early game, or if you're on a very strict budget. I think it's high time that we moved along and talked about the gloves. My first choice for the build is going to be the exceedingly cheap Oscarm Nubuck gloves. This glove gives us some really nice defensive benefits, from increased maximum life to a chance to dodge spell hits up to 8%. It also grants us increased critical strike chance based upon our accuracy rating. However, the meat of the item is going to be the curse enemies with level 10 Assassin's Mark on hit. This is one of the cheapest and easiest ways to pick up that effect. Assassin's Mark gives us a huge series of benefits. We crit more often, we deal more damage with those critical strikes, we have a decent chance to gain a power charge every time we slay an enemy that's cursed with Assassin's Mark. This means that while mapping, we'll have 3 power charges up just about all of the time. This grants us another additional 120% chance to crit on top of the huge bonuses it already gives us. And on top of all that, we get 20 life and mana every time we kill an enemy. An extremely convenient and powerful option available for just a handful of chaos. But if you're willing to go that extra mile and hop into the moderate category, we can take advantage of several amazing implicits that the glove can roll. By corrupting the glove, we get access to powerful implicits, curse enemies with level 10 to 12, elemental weakness, enfeeble, or temporal chains on hit. In Path of Exile, you can only inflict 1 curse upon an enemy, but there are ways to increase that limit, and we'll be discussing that in the very next gear slot. As it stands, getting this corruption for the gloves allows them to be double curse gloves, and if we have the ability to inflict 2 curses, the power that we can eke out of these gloves is insane. So we've talked about the raw power of Assassin's Mark, but imagine combining that with elemental weakness, which causes our enemies' elemental resistances to go down by 31%. Or picture adding temporal chains to the build. Cursed, magic, and normal enemies will have 25% reduced action speed, and cursed rare and unique enemies will have 12% reduced action speed. This causes all their animations, everything they do is going to be playing out slower. All their attacks, their movement speed will be slowed down. This allows you to see their attacks and their actions in a more telegraphed way, giving you a little bit more time to dodge, to avoid their mechanics, and to just be able to swoop in and kill them before they're hardly able to do anything at all. And combining this with all the chill and freeze you're going to be inflicting just makes the bosses all that much slower. And finally, give some real consideration to Enfeeble, which will lower your enemy's critical strike chance, accuracy rating, and critical strike multiplier. It also applies a pretty massive debuff, causing your enemies that are normal and magic to deal 26% less damage, and rare and uniques will deal 13% less damage. This huge reduction in damage can make all the difference in the world. It can be the difference between life and death. Adding this to the build gives you another fantastic defensive layer, allowing you to survive in a lot of situations where you otherwise wouldn't have. An alternative option is going to be in the cheap to moderate category and is going to be a rare glove. Ideally, you're going to be looking for a gripped glove that increases projectile attack damage, but any base you can get your hands on will work just fine, and prioritizing the main stats of the glove are going to be more important. On the gloves, you're going to be looking for all of the classic rare gear stats. You're going to want a large life roll, 80 plus if possible. Stack as many resists as you can. Theoretically, trying to get more than 60 or 80% will alleviate the pressure on other gear, as we're not looking for a ton of really key stats on the gloves if you are going with the rare option. Additionally, looking for offensive stats such as added physical damage to attacks, added cold damage to attacks, and increased attack speed, as well as the stat percentage increased damage with hits against chilled enemies. Pile on as many of these as you can and you'll have a solid set of rare gloves if you aren't wanting to go with the Oscarms. And finally, we're going to have our expensive option for the slot, which is going to be the Tomb Fist gloves. These gloves come with 1 to 2 abyssal sockets and can be extremely powerful depending on what kind of abyss jewels you have access to. These will be very cheap to just get a single socket version. If this sounds appealing to you, make sure you get a Murderous Eye Jewel socketed in so you'll be intimidating your enemies on hit for 4 seconds, causing them to take about 10% more damage. Going with this option, however, forces us to try to get Assassin's Mark elsewhere, specifically on our ring. If you're going to go for Tomb Fist, I would highly recommend to only do so if you have a very large budget and you can afford either a 2-socket version, which can get very expensive, or a 1-socket corrupted version that has really good implicits like the 3 curses we discussed, or the additional crit chance with attacks. Or if you have more money than God, pick up a 2-socket version with one of those same implicits. But my chief recommendation will be to pick up the moderately priced Oscarm Nubuck gloves with a good corruption. If you're looking to save money in this slot, you can just grab the Oscarm Nubucks uncorrupted for very, very cheap. Do this if you're looking to just run Assassin's Mark and don't like the idea of running 2 curses. Furthermore, if you still want to run 2 curses, you can get the uncorrupted version and we can get another curse on our rings later on. Either way, the gloves are a fantastic and affordable option and combine very well with the upcoming choices, so let's hop right into the boots. And my opening recommendation for those is going to be the Wind Shriek Reinforced Greaves. These boots are really well rounded and give us a lot of great stats, but they offer us something that is pretty hard to get our hands on and can be rare to find on a good piece of gear, which is going to be you can apply an additional curse. As a result of the benefit we derive from having that additional curse, essentially the boots can either play a very defensive or offensive role. Combining them with elemental weakness makes them very potent offensively, or if you're looking for those defensive boosts, the Enfeeble and Temporal Chains options will make your fights much easier. The boots also manage to feature a nice 25% movement speed, a little boost to our elemental damage, and some elemental resistances, which are much needed. Overall, a very flexible and versatile piece of gear that does a lot for the build. We also have a very cheap alternative, which is the Adziri Step Slink boots. These boots are very cheap and offer us a big chunk of life, 30% increased movement speed, and a huge up to 16% chance to dodge spell hits, which will be valuable on just about every map in most situations. They are a fantastic budget option and are purely defensive, but will give you some nice benefit. And taking a look at the moderate to expensive category, we've got rare boots in general. A lot of the usual guidelines to follow for rares will apply right here as well. Stack the life, lots of resists. You're going to want to shoot for 30 to 35% movement speed if you can, although 25% will serve you fine and will lower the cost of the boot pretty significantly. Beyond that, try to look for stats such as percentage chance to dodge spell hits or attack hits. A pair of these rare boots isn't going to do anything super flashy, but it gives you those fundamentals that you might be looking for. As far as enchantments go, we're going to be looking for the 16% increased attack and cast speed if you've killed recently. The damage penetrates 10% of enemy resistances if you haven't killed recently is really great against bosses that don't have adds. The 10% chance to dodge attack hits if you've taken a critical strike recently is pretty solid, and the 8% chance to dodge spell hits if you've taken spell damage recently can be pretty nice in a pinch. If you're looking to crank that movement speed, getting the 10% increased movement speed will do a lot of good for the build in terms of mobility. With all that said, I think it's time that we discuss the Amulet selection. And for the first time, we're going to have two primary recommendations based completely on your budget. For those with the cheap to moderate budget, we're going to be looking at picking up a really solid rare amulet. As always, the same rules apply. Look for lots of life, resist if you're still not capped, and then try to focus on stacking a lot of damage into this thing. A high roll of critical strike multiplier is one of our best possible mods and gives us a huge boost to DPS. Look for 30 plus. Beyond that, percentage increased cold damage, added cold damage to attacks, elemental damage with attack skills. You can also look for additional mods such as percentage of physical damage gained as extra cold damage. You can look for percentage of non-chaos damage added as chaos damage. There are so many good offensive mods to choose from. I'm going to be showing a few good options here on the screen right now. The world is your oyster though, as the slot itself is fairly flexible and doesn't require anything in particular, but I would highly prioritize a lot of life, resist, and crit multi for sure. Anything else you can get is going to be a really nice bonus. And for the rich bloods out there who are looking to put that extra dollar value into this build and crank everything they can out of it, I'm going to highly recommend the Pandemonious, a truly powerful amulet that will increase our cold damage, give us a nice chunk of cold resistance, and also chills enemies that we hit for 1 second, reducing their action speed by an entire 30%. We also blind those chilled enemies on hit. The debuff causes enemies that are affected by it to have 50% less chance to hit. And finally, against those same chilled enemies, our damage will now penetrate an additional 20% of their cold resistance. So in summary, the amulet not only increases our damage, but allows us to penetrate a gigantic amount of their cold resistance, while blinding them, making them less likely to hit us, and also slowing them down drastically by 30% action speed, which is a huge debuff and cannot be understated. Consider combining this with Temporal Chains, which will cause our enemies to slow to a crawl while they're affected by both of these effects. Pandemonious just does it all, both offensively and defensively, and if you have the money, I would highly recommend going for it. For these amulets, let's talk about how we're going to anoint them and the best options we have available to us. For very cheap, we can get two fantastic buffs, which will be From the Shadows, gives us about a 6.5% increase to our DPS for a Crimson, an Azure, and a Clear, under 10C. This anointment affects us in a lot of good ways, and as long as you have a Lionized Fall in the Jewel socket, you can get this for very cheap and will give you a boost to damage, attack speed, accuracy, and will give you fairly consistent phasing, which makes mapping even smoother. We were also planning on potentially picking up those 4 nodes, but if you get this anointment, you can remove the other 3 and invest them somewhere else into the tree to get more DPS or more life out of it. Remaining in the very cheap category, we can pick up Farsight. For a Crimson, a Verdant, and a Verdant under 10C again, we can go ahead and pick up a big increase to our attack speed, accuracy, and damage. Very similar, but a little bit more potent offensively, giving us about a 7.7% DPS boost. Moving into the moderate category, we're going to be taking a look at Profane Chemistry. It'll grant us a big boost to maximum life, increased life recovery from flasks, increasing the amount we recover when we use a life flask, which also grants us increased effect of flasks. This effect just lightly scales all of our flasks a little bit, causing us to run a bit faster with Quicksilver or heal a bit more with a life flask. Profane Chemistry will cost you a silver, a black, and a verdant oil, about 85C total. Additionally, in the moderate category, we'll be looking at Cruel Preparation, which gives us a 10% increase to maximum life, as well as 5% to all of our elemental resistances. Just really solid overall. And we'll run you a silver, a black, and a teal oil, right around 85C as well. Moving up the pecking order a little bit, into expensive, we're going to be considering Discipline and Training. For the cost of a silver, and a black, we're going to be looking at getting one of the biggest possible bonuses to our maximum life that's available beyond Constitution, which is extraordinarily expensive. Discipline and Training gives us 30 maximum life and 10% increase to maximum life, giving us a very nice boost to survivability. And finally, in the uber expensive category, we're going to have Whispers of Doom, which grants us that additional curse we were looking for. This either allows us to stack 3 curses, or allows us to remove the Windshriek boots from the build in general to replace them with a more powerful defensive option. For the cost of 2 golden oils and a black oil, around 500C, you gotta be making this worth your while. If you're going to indeed make this a 3 curse setup, I would look to get level 5 Frostbite on a ring. And speaking of rings, let's go ahead and talk about those. My prime recommendation for the build is going to be the moderately priced rare rings. Preferably looking for bases like Coral or Two Stone to give us additional boosts to our life and our resistances. Stack the life, stack the resists, and look for big percentage rolls of elemental damage with attack skills. Additional cold or physical damage to attacks never hurt, and this is a great opportunity to be stacking additional strength and intelligence if you need it for your requirements. And in one of these slots, if you did not want to use the Oscarm Nubuck gloves, this will be one of your best and only opportunities to pick up Assassin's Mark on hit. You'll find this mod on a Shaper ring specifically, and they can get very pricey very quickly, which is why I recommended Oscarm as the primary choice. If you're running the budgeted, regular, uncorrupted Oscarm, and you've still got the Windshriek boots and you want to run 2 curses, you can also take this opportunity to get curse enemies with level 5 Frostbite on hit on one of these rings. This will lower the enemy's cold resistance by 29%. Alternatively, for one of the slots, you could consider running a Circle of Fear Synthesized Sapphire ring. These rings are cheap to moderately priced and are available in a variety of forms. They primarily roll Herald Device related modifiers. These rings can also roll a variety of implicits. Look for life, crit multi, or additional resistances. Anything that's helpful to the build will do just fine. However, the real strength of the ring is going to be those Herald Device modifiers. Look for Herald Device as that increased buff effect or the increased cold damage while affected by Herald Device. Getting both of them is expensive but can be a fantastic offensive option in a very potent ring. However, a much cheaper play will be to get one of the offensive stats, combining it with the cold resistance if you need it, bump up that maximum cold resistance if you want another layer of defense, or try to reduce the mana reservation of Herald Device to free up some mana for skills. The ring is very versatile and quite strange, but can provide some really solid benefits if you find a nice variation of it. And finally, for those with a very expensive budget, we're looking at the Taming ring. Rocking these gives you a pretty ridiculous amount of resistances and a huge boost to percentage increased elemental damage. These can be quite strong, but are not recommended unless you have the health and cash to spare. And finally, that brings us to the belt slot. I'm once again going to be recommending 2 different options here, but it's because one key variation separates 2 otherwise very similar belts in price. Our opening cheap to moderate option is going to be a leather belt with a really high life roll, tons of resists, and elemental damage with attack skills. Leather belts can easily provide over 120 life to the build and are a really well-rounded option. Alternatively, for a moderate to expensive budget, you can pick up a very similar belt with high life, high resistances, and elemental damage with attack skills in the form of a Stygian Vice. It will of course be a super similar belt fundamentally, but that Abyssal Jewel socket gives you the opportunity to add a Searching Eye Jewel to your build. Within that jewel, and essentially then the belt, you can add another 40 life, added cold damage, fizz damage, attack speed, or even crit multi. This little boost just pushes the versatility and power of the Stygian just out of reach of the leather belt, and it's the best option for the slot if you can afford it. And that brings us to our flasks. And we're going to begin with the classic Alchemist's Quicksilver Flask of Adrenaline. This version gives us additional movement speed on top of the movement speed it already grants and increases the effect of that movement speed inherently, although it decreases the duration. This provides us with an invaluable boost to our movement speed. This specific combination of stats can get moderately expensive, but on the very low end, between 20 and 30 C. And if you're looking to get a cheaper option, get the additional movement speed, but then get increased duration instead. Our next flask is going to be the Experimenter's Diamond Flask of Staunching. This flask makes our critical strike chance lucky, meaning that the game will roll twice to see if we crit and take the higher roll, giving us a huge increase to our effective crit chance. And thanks to Staunching, we'll be gaining immunity to bleeding during the flask effect and removing bleeding when we use the flask. A fantastic boost to our survivability, as bleeding can kill you shockingly fast. I went ahead and picked up a version that had increased duration as well, but this is very flexible and you should be able to get this flask for quite cheap. Next up is going to be the invaluable Dying Sun. This flask is a beast and causes both our Ice Shot and our Void Shot to fire 2 additional projectiles, as well as increasing the area of effect of those skills as well. The flask also grants us a huge boost of fire resistance and reduced fire damage taken. This flask is moderately expensive, but very attainable and is highly recommended for the build. Up next, we've got the mechanically complex Cinder Swallow Flask. This flask grants us Onslaught, giving us 20% increased attack and movement speed, and also grants us up to 3% of life, mana, and energy shield on kill. And on top of all of those effects, it's going to have a crafted modifier, and the one we're looking for is 60 to 80% increased critical strike chance during flask effect. The crit chance is very nice to have, but makes the flask a lot more expensive. Alternatively, you can consider Wise Oak for increased elemental penetration and some reduced damage taken, or you can get Itziri's Promise, which will give you a big chunk of increased damage. This slot specifically is the most flexible in the build, and you can customize it how you like. In the final slot, we'll be utilizing a Divine Life Flask. You can take this Life Flask in any direction you want, but I would highly recommend getting Freeze and Chill immunity. I also personally use and recommend an instant version of the flask, which allows you to recover all of that life instantly upon using it. When you can spam 3 uses and you're gaining about 1,000 life each time, you can go back up to full from a very dire situation very quickly. And wrapping up the gear, let's do a quick stop on the jewels of the build. We're going to be utilizing in this specific jewel socket right here a Lionized Fall. This jewel essentially takes all melee and melee weapon types and converts them to bow. So if you're like, this specific set of nodes is affecting daggers, this is swords, this is claws, all of those are converted to affect bows specifically, making them applicable to our build. This gives us access to Soul Raker for powerful life and mana leech, Claws of the Hawk for a huge chunk of crit chance and crit multi, and From the Shadows, which can give us a nice boost to attack speed, damage, and provide us with phasing. We're also going to be budget permitting using a Watcher's Eye. We run both Precision and Hatred, so we're going to be focusing on trying to get modifiers that improve or play off of having those 2 auras. With a very cheap and restricted budget, you're only going to be able to hope to get one modifier, either Hatred or Precision. With a moderate budget, you can either get a better single stat or you can get a 2 stat, but one of those stats is going to be very lackluster. And with a very expensive budget, you can absolutely get 2 relevant stats on your Watcher's Eye. For Hatred specifically, we're going to be looking for X percentage to critical strike chance, damage penetrates percentage of cold resistance, added cold damage, or percentage increased cold damage. And for Precision, we're going to be looking for increased attack speed, increased attack damage, percentage to critical strike multiplier, or gain a flash charge when you deal a critical strike. All of these stats are going to be fantastic for the build, so give some consideration to your budget and take a look around. And finally, we're going to have a few additional jewel sockets either in the tree or in our belts or in other pieces of the gear that I've recommended throughout the video. No matter how many slots you have, we're going to want to fill a lot of those with Searching Eye jewels. These jewels specifically tailor themselves to bow attacks. We're going to be looking for modifiers such as a high life roll above 30. We're going to be looking for crit multiplier, percentage increased attack speed if you dealt a critical strike recently, and of course we're looking for added physical damage or cold damage to attacks and to bow attacks. You can also look for jewels that have added movement speed and even additional resistances. And with that said, our breakdown of the gear choices is complete, and it's time to move into the skills and links that make this build as strong as it is. We will begin, of course, with Ice Shot, which will first be linked to elemental damage with attacks, which at level 20 gives us 54% more elemental damage, one of the biggest damage boosts we have access to. In the third slot, we'll have added cold damage support, which grants us at level 20 169 to 254 additional cold damage. The high-end levels of added cold damage make a huge difference to the damage it provides, so if you have the budget, look for a level 21 version. For our fourth link, we're going to have Hypothermia support. This gem does a couple different things for us. It increases the effective chill on enemies and also increases our chance to freeze enemies that are chilled. But beyond that, the major reason we're picking it is because it grants us 39% more damage, a huge boost against specifically chilled enemies. For the fifth link, we're going to be looking at picking up Inspiration support. This gem has really flown under the radar and just hasn't gotten the usage that I feel it deserves. At level 20, it reduces the cost of our Ice Shot by 34%. So the way Inspiration support works is that whenever you use mana on a skill, so whenever you attack with Ice Shot, it's going to be immediately giving you an Inspiration charge. Those charges stack up to 5, and when you have all of them up at level 20, each charge grants you 8% more elemental damage and 10% increased critical strike chance. So in total, all the charges are up, you got 50% increased critical strike chance and 40% more elemental damage. The only catch being that you lose all those inspiration charges, but only after you spend 800 total mana. We attack quick, so you're going to have those 5 inspiration charges very fast, and even once they're already at max, you still have another 28 attacks before you reach that 800 mana limit, and then the charges will disappear, sure, but they'll be back up in about a second. The support gem does it all, and you'll still have it up 95% of the time. Really, really strong. And finally, we're going to have the sixth and final link, which we have a variety of options for. This is where it's really going to come down to personal preference for you. I can make my own recommendation here, but this is going to be how you feel the build plays best and what kind of situations you want to use the build for. First up, we're going to have Mirage Archer, which in a lot of builds is really fantastic and still does some really substantial work here. You kind of end up killing packs so quickly that Mirage Archer doesn't always end up being as helpful as you want it to be, but it still helps clean up stragglers. It can also be really helpful during boss fights just for the added damage that it provides, or helping to clean up the additional mobs that it's spawning around you. And honestly, just the little quality of life bonuses it provides, like just that extra shot, could really help clear that pack in a certain situation. It can also be really nice when you're running around and you've just killed some packs, but you don't want to break that movement speed. Sometimes Mirage Archer will just blow up the packs around you instantly, and for just a second, it's like you're playing old Winter Orb. You're just running around and Mirage Archer's doing all the work. It won't happen all the time, but Mirage Archer certainly has some major benefits, especially if you're mapping a lot. The second alternative is going to be Chain, which because of our Deadeye Ascendancy Ricochet, the more chains that are remaining that haven't been used up yet, the more damage we do to an enemy. However, Chain, even at level 20, still makes our skills deal 11% less damage with hits, but with all the chain bonus, we can get a little bit of extra DPS, about an additional 5% DPS from having Chain in the links. Chain is just so much harder to recommend fundamentally for me, as we have so much AoE, from Void Shot, from Herald of Ice, from Ice Shot itself. It just feels unnecessary. However, its impact is still fairly substantial in some situations. When you're in a very condensed map that has a lot of packs near each other, having those additional chains can sometimes cause you to basically just shoot a few rounds and the whole vicinity is pretty much annihilated, and you wonder where all the packs are in this map. If you're the kind of person who really loves to run a ton of legions, blights, blighted maps, things that have an insane amount of enemies in a really small area, this will be a great support for you. Furthermore, if you feel like your damage is really sufficient for the map tier you're farming, if you're specifically farming lower tier, mid tier maps and you're feeling extremely comfortable, you could consider dropping either the added cold damage or the hypothermia support and run both Chain and Mirage Archer in one setup. And on the flip side, if you're wanting to go for maximum damage, in the sixth link, as opposed to running either Chain or Mirage Archer, you can add Cold Penetration support, a really fantastic support gem that at level 20 causes our skills to penetrate 37% of our enemy's cold resistance. Committing to this sixth link is meaning that you're going for straight boss killing potential, or just trying to push the damage as high as it can go. It will reduce your clear speed slightly, but you'll still be doing really good work, honestly, and it may not even make a big difference. This can be great just for high tier mapping, but especially for boss killing and farming endgame. Cold Pen is solid against regular mobs, really good against bosses, and fantastic against the endgame bosses who have a ton of elemental resistance. My utmost recommendation would be to either pick Mirage Archer or Cold Penetration for the sixth link, but take this in whatever direction you feel works the best. Whatever feels the best to play, go ahead and give that a shot. I also want to feature an optional addition to the build, which is going to be having a second 5 or 6 link that contains Barrage, specifically to kill bosses even faster. I had absolutely no issue making it through basically the entire game with just Ice Shot. However, if you're looking to crank that extra bit of juice out of the build, this can be a great way to do it. If you have the cash, gear, and slots available, using Barrage will boost your single target damage pretty significantly and can be worth the time. For the 5 link, go for Barrage combined with elemental damage with attacks, elemental focus, hypothermia support, and added cold damage. And finally, if you get the 6th link, pick up cold penetration support. As previously stated, this is not required for the build and is completely optional, but if you have the space and the budget, it's a great idea to make happen if you want to push the single target to its limits. Next up, we're going to have our movement skill, which is going to be a very simple blink arrow combined with faster attacks. The placement of these links is very flexible and can be put pretty much anywhere in the build where you have room. Next up is going to be our auras. We're going to have Precision, Herald of Ice, Hatred, and then a level 2 to 4 Enlighten, all in a 4 link. We'll be using Precision at a very low level, somewhere between level 1 and level 5, to reduce its mana reservation impact on us. It grants us a big chunk of critical strike chance as well as some accuracy rating for very little cost. We'll also be using Herald of Ice as previously discussed. It adds cold damage to our attacks and causes all the enemies we shatter to explode, which increases our clear speed pretty drastically. And finally, we'll be running Hatred, which causes us to gain 25% of our physical damage as extra cold damage, and causes us to also deal 18% more cold damage, a very strong support for us. And the final part of the link will be an Enlighten. It's very flexible here, anything from level 2 to 4 will be helpful, and will reduce the amount that these auras reserve, especially Hatred. This simply frees up a little bit more mana for us to use actively on skills, and causes us to run out of mana less often. Next up is going to be a 3 link of Vol Grace, Vol Haste, and Increased Duration. We will not be using the actual aura versions of these skills. We're not using Grace or Haste itself, we're using the Vol portion of it. So as we kill mobs, it'll fill up these skills with souls, and then upon reaching a certain threshold, you can trigger them with a button press, and when you trigger Vol Grace, you'll get 34% chance to dodge attack and spell hits. Super nice defensively, and with Vol Haste, whenever you trigger it on full souls, you'll be getting 13% movement speed and 31% increased attack speed. The initial duration of Vol Grace and Vol Haste is quite short, but with increased duration, we can take it to a really reasonable level, and it just improves the quality of life when using these gems. Next up, we're going to have another defensive setup, which is going to be Steel Skin combined with Cast when damage taken. And as I have it set up, whenever you take a total of 1,980 damage, which is a reasonable chunk of our life pool, about 40%, it will trigger Steel Skin. And at the levels we're using it, it's going to give us a buff that can take an additional 1,711 damage. Keep in mind that only 70% of the damage from hits will be taken from the buff, but that's enough when we still have 3,000 life remaining. This essentially expands our life pool very drastically and allows us to take a ton of additional damage. This will be triggering quite often when you get hit severely. The only thing to be concerned about when setting up this 2 link is that Cast when damage taken support will indicate on its gem how high of a level it can support. So at level 14, Cast when damage taken can support gems that require level 64 or lower, and our Steel Skin at level 18 requires the player to be level 64. Thus, the gem currently works and will be supported by Cast when damage taken, but if we were to level up Steel Skin without leveling up Cast when damage taken, it would cease to function and Steel Skin would not be triggered. So if you want this to trigger more often, and you want this to be triggering when you're taking lighter amounts of damage, you'll have to run a lower level of Steel Skin and a lower level of Cast when damage taken support. It may trigger more often, but every level of Steel Skin that it goes down means that it'll prevent less damage. My current recommendation is to have Steel Skin at level 18 and Cast when damage taken at level 14, or if you want to get a little bit more juice out of the buff, go with Steel Skin level 19 and Cast when damage taken level 17. But you can customize this however you like. And finally, we've got the 3 odd ones out. Good skills that I want to recommend that can be slotted pretty much anywhere. First up, we've got Portal. It can be slotted in any color socket and just simply removes the need to have portal scrolls. You just press a button and you'll have a portal out of the map instantly. Next is Withering Step, which I've grown to love way more than Phase Run. It immediately grants you Elusive, which would inherently grant you 40% increased movement speed and a 20% chance to dodge both attack and spell hits. That's already pretty incredible, but it also comes with an increased effect of Elusive. So at level 20, it will give you 42% increased effect of Elusive, making it last both longer and give you a way stronger initial effect. This means that in the instant you use it, you will be getting 56.8% increased movement speed and 28.4% chance to dodge both attack and spell hits. Granted that this buff constantly loses its value. As the elusive buff ticks down, so too does the advantage it gives you. The lower the multiplier, the less effect it's having on you. But we're not using it for that purpose. Withering Step and its effective elusive will disappear the instant we use a skill. We're using this purely to give us a massive boost of speed when we're either just looting or need to run to the next pack. And we also get that fantastic added benefit of being able to dodge so much more effectively when we're running around looting or just trying to traverse the map while the elusive effect is up. And finally, if you can find room for it and you feel comfortable using another additional skill and kind of babysitting it a bit, we have Blood Rage. We're going to be leeching a lot and recovering a lot of life very quickly, so using Blood Rage basically just gives us access to a small attack speed bonus, but also gives us Frenzy Charge generation. Each Frenzy Charge grants us 4% more damage, so when we have all three up, 12% more damage and 15% increased attack speed is really nice to have, but it does cause us to constantly lose a decent chunk of life. This can be run in the 4-link with increased duration, Vol Grace, and Vol Haste if you like. If you want it to last a really long time, it can be a bit more convenient that way, but sometimes I find the effect running just too long for my liking. If you enjoy using Blood Rage, give it a shot. It's a really nice chunk of added damage, but I can find it really tedious to use, and I don't heavily recommend it unless you're really looking for that extra boost. That's going to do it for all of our skills and gems, so let's go ahead and talk about the Bandits. For me, as I recommended in the last build, this is going to be a pretty clear-cut choice between Alira, which grants us 20% crit multi and 15% to our elemental resistances, or just killing all of the bandits for the 2 additional skill points. Alira's boost to the build is nice and it's very convenient. However, I would highly recommend just getting the 2 skill points, as we have plenty of different things that we want to be spending these points on, and I think they're all going to be about as effective. This does come down to personal preference a little bit though, as the overall impact on the build will be very comparable. If you go with Alira, you're not making the wrong choice, just going in a different direction. With that said, let's go ahead and have a little talk about the Pantheon choices. As an evasion-based build, I heavily recommend getting Soul of Lunaris as the major god. This grants us a really nice physical damage reduction for each nearby enemy up to 8%, and also gives us a little movement speed boost when engaging packs. And if you go ahead and capture the Ancient Architect, Sebert, and Ambrius will be gaining a 10% chance to avoid projectile damage, an additional chance to dodge attacks and spells if we've been hit recently, and we will avoid all projectiles that have chained. A really strong evasive ascendancy that allows us to just get hit even less. And for the minor gods, I would consider picking up Soul of Gurukhan, which gives you a chance to evade attacks if you've taken a savage hit recently. A savage hit is a hit that takes at least 15% of your maximum life away. And if you go ahead and pick up Stalker of the Endless Dunes, you'll get an inherent movement speed bonus of 6% that'll be active almost all the time if you haven't been hit. That's super nice all around, but you could also pick up Soul of Rislotha, which will grant your life flasks 3 charges every 3 seconds if you haven't used one recently, which will indeed give you a bit more uptime with your life flasks, but this is mostly good if you capture Garrulus Will Thief. If you do so, you will have 60% increased life recovery from flasks, meaning that the amount it says it will recover on the flask will be 60% higher if the flask is used when you're on low life, which will trigger whenever you use a flask below 35% life. This is especially good when using an instant life flask. Imagine we drop down to 25% life that first usage. Instead of recovering, say, 1,000 life with that one use of the flask, we'll instead recover 1,600 life, giving us a nice initial boost to our recovery. Earlier in the video, we already did a fairly deep dive into the Ascendancy, but I wanted to quickly cover it and talk about the order that you might want to take these Ascendancies in. Deadeye has been very strong for a while now, and it's popular for good reason. During the leveling process, when we get our first Ascendancy, we're going to want to first take 7 and 8 to pick up Gathering Winds. This will immediately give us an action speed bonus, causing us to move faster, attack faster, do everything faster, which makes progressing through the levels that much easier. Next up, with a second Ascendancy, we'll want to pick up 3 and 4 to get Far Shot. This gives us additional projectile speed, but also grants us the much more important more damage, up to 30% more depending on how far away the target is. The farther the target, the more damage we deal. Both of the remaining Ascendancies are going to be focused very heavily on making the build clear and function as well as possible. The order you take here is optional, but I would recommend going 5 and 6 into Endless Munitions. It grants us that additional projectile we've been looking for, and a big increase to our area of effect and accuracy, improving our clear speed drastically. And finally, for our Uber Lab and final Ascendancy, we'll be going 9 and 10 into Ricochet. This gives us that chain that we've been looking for, and also causes those projectiles to deal 10% more damage to the first enemy they hit if they haven't chained yet. At this stage, you'll want to make sure that there is no pierce associated with the build, so in summary, pick up Gathering Winds, into Far Shot, into Endless Munitions, and finally Ricochet. Next up, we're going to be discussing how to level this build and taking a look at the skill tree and the progression you might want to take in the early levels. For those of you that just want to see the skill tree and see the direction that we went with it, here's a broad overview. And for those of you who want to see a early progression of the build, see what directions you might want to take it first, I'll go through that right now. Early on, nodes that you're going to want to prioritize are going to be picking up Winter Spirit. These two nodes right here are going to give us a total of 40% of our physical damage converted to cold. Ice Shot already gives us 60%, so that's 100% total with those nodes and Ice Shot combined of our physical damage will be converted into cold damage. Very early on, you'll want to move down and left to pick up Point Blank, which will grant you 50% more damage to targets at the very start of your projectile's movement, dealing less damage the farther the projectile goes, but always giving you some level of bonus, just a lessened bonus if they're far away. You also want to go ahead and pick up Fangs of Frost for the cold damage resistance penetration and the additional cold damage as well. From there, you want to focus on getting lethality for a big boost to your critical strike chance and multiplier, picking up Primeval Force for the added elemental damage and elemental damage resistance penetration. Moving up, we have some great nodes in Herbalism for a big boost to our life and our life recovery, and Heartseeker, which gives us a nice chunk of crit and crit multiplier. The two big bow arcs to the right, King of the Hill and Master Fletcher, will be granting you tons of damage, attack speed, critical strike chance, and crit multi. And moving up and to the right, we're going to want to be picking up Acrobatics and Phase Acrobatics as soon as possible. Directly above that is going to be a jewel socket we will need. You're going to want to socket Lion-Eyes Fall into this jewel socket specifically. This changes all the modifiers for Soul Raker, Claws of the Hawk, the majority of the small nodes next to those, and all of the nodes from the Shadows and the associated nodes into affecting bows instead of claws and daggers respectively. From the Shadows can be left until a little bit later though, so you'll want to swing up and immediately get Claws of the Hawk and Soul Raker for all of that life and mana leech, as well as the huge chunk of crit chance and crit multi it'll be granting us. This for me is the recommended choice for what you want to prioritize right away. Everything I've just mentioned is stuff that you should try to get within the first big chunk of levels. It gives us access to powerful leech, tons of crit and crit multi, a lot of elemental damage, and a decent chunk of life, as well as converting all of our physical damage into cold. From here, you can basically start filling out the tree as you go along, picking out certain spots in my build or certain spots that you like yourself if you want to make changes to it, and just start working into those. As you're leveling up, take a look around the skill tree, or take a look at my plan and see what you think seems really interesting, and start planning to move into stuff. So as you level up, keep using your points actively, but try to plan which direction you're going in. Make a concerted effort to make those points count and to contribute towards getting really strong nodes that will help the build. As always, this is just a solid recommendation for the way to take the build and the tree that you can use, but it is not a requirement. A lot of these things can be switched and swapped out for whatever you want. It's kind of half the fun of playing these builds, is taking them in whatever direction you will enjoy the most. And with all that said, I'd like to discuss a little bit of leveling gear that can help you progress this character much faster. Without a shadow of doubt in my mind, the most important piece of gear to have right away is going to be a Tabula Rasa. It gives you access at level 1 to an instant 6-link, which not only gives you immense damage very early on, but also has completely white sockets, meaning that you can customize the links of the main skills, especially Ice Shot, in whatever way you like, and have complete creative freedom to customize the build and to try out new things and learn about how it functions. This is a little bit more expensive, but it's something that if you want to level a second character and you've already made a first, you'll absolutely want to pick this up. It will only be around the 20C range and makes the leveling experience so much faster, smoother, and a lot more fun. Gold Rim is an absolute staple of early leveling and gives you a massive chunk of resistances that can last you for the entire game and can be equipped at level 1. For this build, I would recommend picking up the Locentennial Caress gloves, as they give you a big chunk of attack speed, some maximum life, and will grant you a random assortment of power, frenzy, and endurance charges, boosting your build. There's no beating the Wanderlust boots. They can be equipped very early and give you an immediate 20% increase to your movement speed, as well as a boost to your mana regeneration rate, which is huge when you're going to be using more expensive skills with Tabula than you should be normally using at that level. Additionally, the ability to not be frozen is super convenient, and you're going to miss it when you unequip the boots. Absolutely fantastic early on and can be used for almost the entire leveling process with no issues. I would also really highly recommend picking up an Its Series foible. This amulet grants you, when it's well rolled, up to 130% increased mana regeneration rate, once again contributing very heavily to making sure that you're not running out of mana constantly. It also gives you a huge chunk of mana early on, and also makes it so that all items and gems have got 25% reduced attribute requirements, meaning that everything is going to be easier to equip and requires less strength, int, or dexterity to use. Early on, I would recommend using a pair of Miranda Signets. They grant you increased mana regeneration rate and also increased experience gain. However, the instant you hit level 30, I would replace both of those with a Thief's Torment Prismatic Ring, granting you a lot of elemental resistance, but mainly granting you up to 60 life and 30 mana every time you hit an enemy with any of your attacks, which is going to be happening a lot. This ring goes a really long way to keeping you both alive and keeping your mana up to use more skills. I could not recommend it more. For the belt, I would recommend the Meganord's Girdle. It's going to grant you a bunch of life, strength, cold resistance, and some increased flask recovery rate, but it also gives you a big chunk of physical damage, which will all be converted into cold, boosting our DPS early on. This can then be upgraded at level 25 for Prism Weave, which will be a nice bonus. As far as the bows go, early on I would recommend using either a Stormcloud or a Quill Rain. Level 18, a Wrath's Reach does some really good work for us in the early game, allowing our skills to chain one additional time, as well as converting all of its physical damage into cold and boosting our elemental damage inherently. At level 10, you'll want to use Hiri's Bite as your quiver. It grants you strength, dexterity, intelligence, a bunch of cold damage, attack speed, it does it all. It's going to be a very well-rounded and solid quiver that can carry you through a huge chunk of the game. Please keep in mind that none of this is dead required, and that you can make this build work by simply just playing it naturally. You don't need to pick up any gear. This is simply if you want to make the leveling experience fast and smooth. You can pick up some elements of the gear. What I'd recommend the most highly would be to get the Gold Rim, the Wanderlust, the Tabula. Certainly get one of the bows, they're all very cheap, and definitely give some heavy consideration to picking up the Thief's Torment when you can equip it. But as far as leveling the build goes, you can genuinely take Ice Shot from the very first level of the game all the way into the end game. You do not have to mess around with other skills. There are no alternatives here that are required to use. You just can take Ice Shot and slowly add elemental damage with attacks, added cold damage, and then work into Inspiration, Hypothermia, and eventually maybe Chain, Mirage Archer, or Cold Penetration as you get that 6th link. A really convenient support to also be using during the leveling process would be to mix in a faster attacks until you get some of the better options. So simply utilizing this gear, get Ice Shot early, and then just work on scaling it throughout the game, adding the support gems as you get them, get the Ascendancies as they become available and doable, and the build should smoothly progress on its own as you pick up the individual pieces of the build and slowly put it together. With all of that covered, I think that we've finally reached the very end conclusion of the build. Ice Shot, especially with its new iteration, has proven to be very versatile and powerful, capable of handling just about anything the game can throw at it. This is a build that you can take as an absolute beginner and slowly progress it at your own pace, and you should be able to reach into fairly deep endgame with enough investment and enough time spent learning the deeper mechanics and becoming used to the playstyle. I really wanted to take the time to showcase one of my favorite skills in the game, and I hope that the build guide proved to be helpful. I wanted to take a brief moment to acknowledge just how much support the Wild Strike video has gotten. I truly appreciate everyone who watched. Thank you so much. It's honestly just left me feeling a little confused how this video has gotten so much traction, how the channel has grown so quickly. It's got me excited to make more longer form content and to continue to try to push the quality of every video. As always, if you have any feedback for me or questions about the build, I will be more than happy to try to help in the comments down below. Thank you so much for all the support on this video. I appreciate everyone who's watching. As always, I've been Esero, and I will see you guys in the next video.